The heroes of ancient myth were not born, they were built. The oldest story we know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, survives in multiple versions that tell different tales of the same man's quest. This video uncovers the 21 editing rooms of Antiquity, the secret workshops where scribes rewired the classic hero's journey. You will learn to spot the hidden revisions that changed our core ideas of courage and destiny. Why does Heracles transform from a brute into a virtuous champion? How was a pagan monster hunter reframed as a Christian soldier? By the end, you will never read these ancient stories the same way again. What single hero did you always believe was perfectly good? Think of these 21 editing rooms as ancient publishing houses scattered across the known world. They were not physical chambers with 4 walls and a door, but powerful centers of intellectual gravity. In the great library of Alexandria, in the bustling tablet houses of Mesopotamia, and within quiet monastic scriptoria, scribes held the ultimate power over the stories they preserved. These individuals were far more than mere copyists. They were priests, scholars, and state officials who possessed both the authority and a compelling motive to alter the texts as they saw fit. The number 21 is symbolic, representing the vast but ultimately countable number of major cultural hubs that shaped the heroic tales we inherited. Each room stands for a distinct school of thought, a ruling dynasty, or a religious institution that needed its heroes to reflect a certain ideal. A king in one city might demand his lineage be inserted into an epic, while a priestly class in another would scrub away older gods to make way for new ones. This framework reveals that our classic hero journeys are not pristine originals, but carefully curated versions that passed through multiple filters of ideology and power. To understand why Hercules changes from one scroll to the next, or why a dragon slayer's motive shifts over centuries, you must first grasp this sprawling, invisible network of ancient editors. Their pens were not just recording history, they were actively rewriting it to suit the needs of their time and place. The ink that flowed in these ancient rooms was often the ink of statecraft. A scribe did not pick up his stylus in a vacuum. He was a paid employee of a temple, a royal court, or a wealthy patron. His most important task was not merely to preserve a story, but to ensure it served the interests of the powers that fed him. The primary motive behind countless revisions was pure propaganda, a tool to cement the ruler's divine right to the throne. Think of a local king who just won a brutal war. He could commission a new version of the national epic where the ancient hero faces a nearly identical enemy. Suddenly, the king is not just a man, he is the living embodiment of a legendary champion, his conquests foretold in sacred scripture. His victory was not politics, it was destiny written long ago. This also worked to erase rivals. If a city worshipped a god that challenged the king's preferred deity, scribes could carefully edit that god out of popular myths, reducing their importance or rewriting them as villains. Every time a text was copied, it was an opportunity to curate reality, to manipulate the past in order to control the present. The survival of a story was a high-stakes game of political and social control, where the hero's journey became a weapon to ensure everyone knew their place. The city of Uruk groaned under the weight of its own king. In the oldest clay tablets we possess, Gilgamesh is not a hero, he is a terror. He claims the right to sleep with every bride on her wedding night, and he exhausts his young male subjects with endless, brutal games. This is the raw, unvarnished tyrant of the original Sumerian fragments, a figure of pure power who answers to no one. But then the story travels, moving from one ancient editing room to the next. In the later Akkadian versions, a profound revision occurs, one that would change the course of storytelling forever. The scribes introduced a new character, a solution sent by the gods themselves. They created the wild man Enkidu not as a mere antagonist, but as a deliberate counterbalance, a mirror meant to reflect Gilgamesh's own unchecked nature back at him. This single, brilliant edit transforms the entire epic. It is no longer a simple chronicle of a despot's reign, but a complex journey of friendship and personal growth. The hero's central conflict shifts from an external struggle for power to an internal battle for self-understanding. Gilgamesh becomes redeemable, not because his early actions were justified, but because he was capable of change. This narrative softening was likely a direct reflection of changing societal values. As empires stabilized, the ideal of a king evolved from a mere warrior who took what he wanted into a wise ruler who learned from his mistakes. The scribes were not just correcting a character, they were encoding a new political and moral philosophy into their most cherished story. They laid the foundational stone for the flawed hero archetype we still adore today, proving that the most compelling journeys often begin with a deep and very human flaw. Heracles was a hero forged in violence, not virtue. His original 12 labors, as told in the oldest Greek poems, were not a noble quest. They were a punishment, a brutal atonement for the horrific crime of murdering his own wife and children in a fit of divinely sent madness. This was a flawed, tragic strongman, a weapon of the gods whose immense power was as much a curse as a blessing. But as his story traveled from the early Greek editing rooms to the hands of later Roman and Hellenistic scribes, something remarkable happened. These new editors were steeped in the ideals of Stoic philosophy, a school of thought that prized self-control, duty, and the triumph of rational order over raw emotion. They looked at the old, blood-soaked tales and saw an opportunity. They began a profound moralization of his legend. The labors were no longer framed as a madman's penance. Instead, they were recast as a purposeful, even philosophical, battle against the forces of chaos. Each monstrous foe was no longer just a beast to be slain, but an embodiment of a specific disorder that Heracles, through a combination of strength and newfound cunning, would conquer to make the world safer for civilization. The Nemean lion represented the untamed wild. The Lernaean hydra stood for the resilient nature of evil, and cleaning the Augean stables was a literal and symbolic act of imposing order onto filth and decay. This revision was so complete that it fundamentally rewired the hero's legacy. Heracles transformed from a powerful but chaotic force of nature into the ultimate civilizing hero, a paragon of perseverance who used his might in service of a higher good. This demonstrates the immense power a single philosophical trend, flourishing within a specific network of ancient editing rooms, could wield. It could take a deeply flawed man and refashion him into a timeless symbol of virtue, proving that a hero's purpose is never set in stone, but is always being written and rewritten by the hands of his scribes. Odysseus' famed intelligence was never just about being clever. Before his story was shaped by the poets of Ionian Greece, the character we know as Odysseus existed in much older, rougher folk tales as a classic trickster. In these early traditions, his cunning was often self-serving and morally grey, a tool for personal gain with little regard for the consequences. But the editorial hands working within the cultural hubs of the ancient Greek world saw a different potential in this flawed figure. They took this raw, ambiguous trickster and systematically refined him, elevating his deceit into a virtue. His lies were no longer portrayed as petty deceptions, but as the strategic maneuvers of a brilliant mind navigating an impossible situation. Confronting a one-eyed giant in a cave, brute force was useless. Only a clever lie and a sharpened stake could save him. Returning to a palace full of enemies who sought his throne and his wife, his only weapon was the disguise of a beggar, a ruse that allowed him to test loyalties and plan his victory. The Homeric tradition reframed every act of trickery as a necessary step on the arduous path toward homecoming. This was a profound shift. It created the wise hero archetype, a man whose intellect was just as vital as any warrior's strength. This editorial choice did more than just clean up a character. It embedded a new ideal into the heart of the hero's journey. Success was no longer measured by conquest alone, but by the wisdom to navigate a complex and treacherous world. This revised Odysseus would go on to shape millennia of storytelling, establishing that the greatest heroes are those who can think their way through darkness as well as fight their way through it. Yet even a hero's perfect virtue can be a later addition. In the vast landscape of Indian epic, Rama stands as the paragon of righteousness, the ideal man who never strays from his sacred duty. But textual scholars digging into the oldest layers of the Ramayana find a more complicated figure, a king whose actions are sometimes morally ambiguous and deeply human. One of the most poignant examples is his harsh treatment of his wife, Sita, after he rescues her from the demon king Ravana. In these ancient passages, Rama, bowing to public gossip about her purity during captivity, questions her fidelity and ultimately exiles her, pregnant and alone, to the forest. This is not the flawless god king millions revere today, but a man wrestling with the crushing weight of kingly perception, making a heartbreaking decision that stains his own happiness. This complexity, however, was sanded smooth by later editorial hands. As the bhakti, or devotional, movements gained power across the Indian subcontinent, their scribes operated from a powerful new editing room. Their motive was pure devotion. They needed their central divine figure to be beyond reproach, a perfect being whose every action was a lesson in absolute adherence to dharma, or sacred law. So they began to revise. They framed Sita's exile not as a response to rumor, but as a necessary part of a divine play, a preordained test that proved her ultimate purity beyond any doubt. Rama's difficult choices were systematically reinterpreted, not as human failings, but as the inscrutable, perfect actions of a god. This process of sanctification fundamentally rewired the story's spiritual core. The hero's journey was no longer about a man navigating the impossible conflicts between his heart and his duty. It was transformed into the flawless walk of a deity on earth, a divine exemplar meant not to be questioned but to be worshipped. The complex king was edited into an infallible god, proving that even perfection is a story told by the scribes who hold the pen. But in Rome, a hero could be built from the ground up. The figure of Aeneas, as we know him, is almost entirely a product of one man's desk. Before the poet Virgil put stylus to parchment, Aeneas was a footnote in older Greek cycles, a minor Trojan prince noted for little more than surviving the city's fall. There was no grand destiny, no profound sense of duty. Virgil, working directly under the patronage of Emperor Augustus, performed one of history's most audacious acts of narrative engineering. He invented the core trait that would define Aeneas for all time, the concept of Pietas. This was not mere piety, but a sacred and all-consuming devotion to one's duty toward the gods, one's family, and the rigid fate laid out by the gods. Aeneas becomes a man who does not act for his own glory or desire, but solely for a future he is destined to create. His entire journey is a relentless series of sacrifices made in the name of this duty. He abandons his lover, Dido, not out of cruelty, but because the gods command him to sail on to Italy. He carries his elderly father on his back from the burning ruins of Troy, a living symbol of his obligation to the past. This was not a simple character flourish. It was a meticulously crafted piece of political allegory. Every step of Aeneas's arduous voyage from Troy to the shores of Italy was designed to mirror and legitimize the reign of Augustus. Just as Aeneas endured hardship to fulfill a divine plan for Rome, so too was Augustus portrayed as the culmination of that same celestial destiny, a ruler who brought order after a long period of civil war. Virgil's study was in effect a one-room editing house that completely overwrote a minor mythic figure. He transformed a forgotten survivor into the flawless founding father a new empire needed, proving that a hero's most defining virtue can be a late addition, written to serve the most powerful patron in the room. A hero can slay a monster, but who defines what a monster truly is? In the shadowy halls of Rewrote, the epic of Beowulf presents a warrior of immense strength, yet the version we read today is a profound literary contradiction. The bones of the story, the hero, the three great battles against Grendel, his mother, and the dragon, are the stuff of ancient pagan legend, a celebration of the Germanic heroic code where fame won in battle was the only immortality a person could achieve. But the sole surviving manuscript, copied by Christian monks, is layered with a completely different set of beliefs. The scribes who preserved this tale were working in a new editing room, one defined by the scriptorium and the cross. Their edits were not subtle. They systematically inserted their own god into the narrative, having characters thank the Almighty Father for their victories. They added condemnations of the pagan burial practices that their own ancestors would have honored, framing them as the misguided customs of a damned people. Most crucially, they gave the monster Grendel a specific and damning lineage, identifying him as a descendant of Cain, the first murderer from the Book of Genesis. This single edit was a masterstroke of narrative reframing. It transformed Grendel from a mere, terrifying creature of the wild into a theological symbol, a literal embodiment of the primordial sin of fratricide. Beowulf's fight was no longer just a warrior proving his might to earn glory. It became a moral allegory. He was now a godly agent, perhaps unwittingly, fighting the forces of evil in a universe governed by a Christian divinity. This revision was a pact for survival. By baptizing the old hero in their new faith, the monks ensured the epic would be valued, copied, and preserved in a culture that had no use for pagan poetry. But the cost was the story's original soul, the philosophical underpinnings of a world where fate was blind and glory was everything were carefully scrubbed away and overwritten with a new divine plan. The pagan warrior was edited into a Christian paragon, a testament to the power of the pen to conquer even the strongest of heroes. The transformation of King Arthur's court reveals how a chaotic myth can be forged into a rigid spiritual template. In the oldest Celtic tales, artifacts of power were wild and enigmatic. The Welsh Mabinogion speaks of magical cauldrons that could restore the dead to life, objects of immense power but with no clear moral alignment. They belonged to a world of fairy and folklore, where the otherworld was a place of both wonder and profound danger. This raw material entered a new kind of editing room, the courts of 12th century French nobility. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes were not merely entertainers, they were cultural architects working for powerful patrons. They took these Celtic motifs and systematically refined them, purging the chaotic magic and replacing it with a structured Christian framework. The magical cauldron of plenty was recast as the Holy Grail, the very cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. This was not just a change of props, it was a complete overhaul of the story's purpose. The quest was no longer about acquiring a powerful object, it became a test of spiritual worthiness, A knight's strength with a sword was now secondary to his purity of heart, his chastity, and his devotion to God. The journey inward became as important as the journey through the wilderness. Think of the siege perilous, the empty seat at the round table reserved for the one knight pure enough to achieve the Grail. This single invention encapsulates the entire revision. It transformed the fellowship from a band of elite warriors into a spiritual brotherhood, where the ultimate prize was not land or glory, but divine grace. This fusion of Celtic myth and Christian doctrine created a new archetype, the knight as a holy pilgrim on a sacred mission. The chaotic hero of the old tales was edited into a vessel for divine will, his quest forever redirecting the course of chivalric legend toward a single, shining, and impeccably orthodox goal. Yet even the most terrifying monsters were not safe from the scribe's pen. As philosophical schools like the skeptics and the Stoics gained influence, the ancient world began to shift from a mindset of pure wonder to one of rational inquiry. This new wave of thinking created immense pressure on the old stories, forcing the scribes in Greek and Roman editing rooms to perform a delicate balancing act. They needed to preserve their cultural heritage while making it palatable to an audience that was increasingly skeptical of literal one-eyed giants and bull-headed men. The solution was a brilliant narrative strategy, rationalization. A creature like the Minotaur trapped in its impossible labyrinth was no longer presented as a literal monster. Instead, a scribe might add a new passage suggesting it was a metaphor for a particularly cruel and brutish king, whose personal emblem was a bull, and whose palace was so vast and confusing it was like a maze to navigate. The hero Theseus, then, was not a monster slayer, but a liberator who defeated a tyrant and found his way through the corrupt complexities of his court. Similarly, the wild and lustful centaurs could be reinterpreted. A rationalizing editor might frame them not as half-horse, half-men, but as a primitive tribe of mountain dwellers, so skilled at riding that they seemed to be one with their horses, and WHOSE Chinese letter customs appeared monstrous to civilized Greek city-states. Even the Cyclops Polyphemus, the terrifying cannibal from the Odyssey, could be demoted. A single added line could propose that he was merely a large, antisocial shepherd who lived in a cave with a single, large opening, and whose reputation for brutality grew so large that storytellers transformed him into a literal giant. This was an early form of demythologization. The hero's journey was being fundamentally rewired, its stakes dramatically lowered from a supernatural war against impossible beasts to a symbolic, deeply human struggle. The enemy was no longer a monster from the depths of myth, but the very real savagery and ignorance that threatened the fragile borders of civilization. The hero now fought not with a magical sword, but with the sharper weapon of reason and order. Sometimes the editor's pen worked to magnify the divine, not diminish it. While some ancient scribes were busy rationalizing monsters, others in different rooms were performing the exact opposite revision, amplifying the role of the gods to serve a powerful theological purpose. This was not about making stories more believable, but about making them more devout, more clearly aligned with the growing power of religious institutions. We can see this clearly in the evolution of one of humanity's oldest stories, the Great Flood. In the Mesopotamian epic of Atrahasis, a tale that predates the biblical Noah, the gods send the flood for a startlingly simple reason. Humanity had become too noisy, and the god Enlil could not sleep. The divine decision is portrayed as almost capricious, an act of divine annoyance rather than a judgment of profound moral failure. But as this story was copied and recopied, moving through later Babylonian editing rooms, a subtle but crucial shift occurred. later versions, like the one found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, begin to heighten the moral justification. The noise of humanity is reframed as a sign of their overpopulation and perhaps even their wickedness. This editorial choice transforms the narrative. The gods are no longer irritable landlords but righteous judges. Their decision to wipe the slate clean seems more justified, more righteous from a human perspective. This same pattern of divine amplification echoes through the editorial history of the Hebrew Bible. Scholars who study its earliest layers suggest that the hand of God in the stories of prophets and kings was likely emphasized and expanded over centuries of redaction. A king's victory in an early chronicle might be attributed to his army's strength, but in a later version, that same victory is explicitly and directly credited to the divine intervention of Yahweh. Why make these edits? The motive was to reinforce a core theology of divine providence. Every amplified miracle, every heightened instance of godly command, served a single goal: to ensure the hero's journey was never just a personal trial. It was a clearly directed divine plan, a celestial script where every success was a reward for faith and every failure a punishment for disobedience. This revision fundamentally rewired the stories to strengthen religious authority. If every event, from a king's rise to a nation's fall, was a direct action of a concerned God, then the priests and scribes who interpreted that God's will held immense power. The hero became less an independent agent and more a vessel, his journey a testament not to his own prowess, but to the unquestionable and ever-present hand of the divine. A hero's rejection can be one of the most telling edits of all. When Gilgamesh spurns the goddess Ishtar in the later Babylonian epic, his insults are brutal. He calls her a faulty door that cannot keep out the cold, a shoe that pinches its wearer, and lists her string of doomed former lovers. This scene feels like a classic hero standing up to a capricious deity, but the truth is far more revealing. This was a deliberate character assassination, a systematic downgrade written into the script. In the older Sumerian cycles, this same goddess, known as Inanna, was not a jilted suitor. She was the very source of kingly power, the deity who decided the fates of cities and the men who ruled them. Her centrality was immense and unquestioned. The later Babylonian scribes, operating in a society with increasingly rigid patriarchal structures, could not abide such a powerful female figure, so they rewrote her. They transformed the sovereign goddess into a spiteful and emotionally volatile antagonist. Her divine propositions were no longer commands from a source of authority, but became the unwanted advances of a petty and dangerous figure. This was not an isolated incident. Across the ancient world, from the eastern Mediterranean to the Celtic fringes, a pervasive trend emerges from the editing rooms, the quiet erasure of powerful goddesses. The Greek Hera, once a great goddess in her own right with ancient roots, is often reduced in Homeric epic to the jealous, scheming wife of Zeus. The formidable Morrigan of Irish myth, a goddess of sovereignty and battle, is gradually softened and her edges smoothed in later Christian retellings. Each of these revisions reflects a profound societal shift. As power structures became more centralized and male-dominated, the myths had to change to reflect and reinforce that new reality. The scribes were not just recording theology, they were actively constructing a world where divine power was overwhelmingly male. This single type of edit fundamentally rewired the hero's journey for millennia. It sidelined female agency not just among the gods but on the earthly plane as well. The hero's path became a predominantly male endeavor, his challenges and his divine supporters almost exclusively masculine. By erasing the powerful goddess, the ancient editors quietly reshaped our deepest cultural narratives about power itself and who was fit to wield it. This instinct to impose order is perhaps the most profound editorial shift of all. Before a story could be written down, it lived in the air, told and retold around fires and in marketplaces. These oral tales were not neat, linear narratives. They were often cyclical, repeating seasonal patterns of death and rebirth, or they were episodic, a collection of fantastic adventures that did not necessarily connect in a clear cause and effect chain. A hero might fight a giant one week and a witch the next, with no overarching goal beyond the next thrilling encounter. But when these stories entered the organized, literary world of the scribble editing room, they encountered a new kind of mind, one that craved coherence. The scattered, vibrant tales of a folk hero like Theseus presented a particular problem. One village might tell of him defeating a bandit on the road, while another celebrated his slaying of a monstrous bull. In the oral tradition, these were standalone feats, but a scribe in Athens compiling a national history saw dissonance. His task was to take these independent local legends and weave them into a single, grand tapestry that explained the hero's path to the throne. So he began to sequence them. He decided that the fight with the bandit Procrustes must have happened before the encounter with the Minotaur in Crete, and that his return to claim his birthright in Athens was the ultimate climax of them all. This was the birth of the classic hero's journey as a plotted structure. The scribe, in that moment, became the original plotter. He imposed a teleological framework, a sense that every event was a stepping stone leading inexorably toward a final, predetermined destination. A random series of wonders was transformed into a coherent life story with a clear beginning, a call to adventure, a defined series of trials, and a final return or apotheosis. This editorial act did more than just clean up a myth. It fundamentally rewired our very expectation of what a story should be. It created the narrative arc we still crave today, the satisfying sense that a hero's scattered struggles were all part of a single, meaningful journey toward a destined end. The hero's journey could also become the founding myth of a nation. The legendary tale of Romulus and the founding of Rome did not spring forth fully formed. Its earliest origins were likely simple, local stories told by the tribes of the Italian hills, perhaps about a strong chieftain who established a settlement on the Palatine. But as Rome grew from a city-state into a vast republic and then an empire, its historians faced a pressing need. They required an origin story that matched their burgeoning power, a narrative worthy of a people destined to rule the known world. This need created a powerful new editing room, one not in a library but in the heart of the Roman state itself. Writers like Livy, working under the shadow of the first emperor Augustus, took those raw, local legends and performed a masterful act of patriotic revision. They layered the story with profound symbolic weight. They gave Romulus and his twin brother Remus a divine father, the god Mars, instantly elevating their lineage from mortal to celestial. They added the iconic, miraculous survival story of the infants, cast into the Tiber River only to be suckled by a she-wolf and raised by a shepherd. This was more than a charming detail. It was a powerful symbol of the future Rome's fierce and nurturing nature. But the most telling edit of all was the foundational act of fratricide. In Livy's account, Romulus does not merely defeat his brother in a dispute over where to build the city. He kills him, declaring that so perish whoever else shall leap over my walls. This was not just a personal tragedy. It was loaded with deep political symbolism for a state perpetually grappling with internal conflict. It framed the very origin of the city in an act of ruthless, necessary violence undertaken for the sake of order and security. Through these deliberate revisions, the Roman editing room completely rewired the hero's journey. Romulus was no longer a local chieftain on a personal quest for glory. His entire life, from divine birth to fatal conflict, became an inseparable part of the state's origin story. The hero's path was now the nation's destiny, his virtues the state's virtues, and his flaws a permanent, haunting part of its political DNA. A hero's journey could not afford to contradict itself. In the bustling, cosmopolitan heart of classical Athens, a city brimming with playwrights, philosophers, and travelers from across the known world, the sheer variety of local myths created a profound problem. The same god or hero was celebrated in wildly different ways from one village to the next. The god Dionysus, for instance, presented a particularly chaotic portfolio. One tradition claimed he was born in Thebes, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. Another insisted his birthplace was a distant, misty mountain. Some stories portrayed him as a gentle bringer of wine and ecstasy, while others depicted a vengeful, brutal deity who drove his opponents mad. For a city like Athens, which saw itself as the cultural center of Greece, this was more than a theological puzzle. It was a threat to social cohesion. How could a city-state unite under a common religious banner if the stories of its own gods were at war with each other? This challenge gave rise to a new kind of scribble work, the 13th revision, the art of harmonization. Athenian scholars and poets became narrative diplomats. They took these conflicting accounts and wove them together into a single, more or less standard biography for Dionysus. They decided his birth in Thebes was the true one, but they incorporated his travels to far-off lands as a necessary part of his divine mission to spread the cultivation of the vine. The gentle god and the vengeful god were reconciled as two sides of the same coin, a deity whose gifts of joy came with a stern warning against rejecting his sacred rites. This was not simply tidying up a story. It was an act of profound cultural engineering. By smoothing over these theological inconsistencies, the scribes created a unified religious narrative for a pan-Hellenic audience. A merchant from Corinth and a sailor from Sparta could now share a common understanding of the god they both worshipped. This harmonization directly rewired the hero's journey, transforming it from a local folktale into a standardized epic. The hero's path was no longer a collection of random, contradictory adventures, but a coherent life story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, approved by the cultural authorities in Athens. This revision served a powerful political purpose, preventing doctrinal disputes and fostering a shared Greek identity that transcended local rivalries. The myth became a tool, and the scribe's pen was the instrument that tuned all the different stories to sing the same unifying song. But a hero's failure could be just as instructive as his success. The ancient Greek myth of Icarus is at its heart a simple explanation for why the sea is named the Icarian. It tells of a boy who, with wings crafted by his brilliant father Daedalus, flies too high. The sun melts the wax holding his feathers, and he plummets into the waters below. This original ending is stark and tragic, a straightforward cause and effect. Yet as this story passed through later Greek and then Roman editing rooms, a profound change occurred. Scribes began to append a new layer to the narrative, a moralizing epilogue that would come to define the tale for millennia. They systematically redirected the audience's focus away from the breathtaking wonder of human flight and toward a single, sobering lesson about the dangers of hubris. Icarus was no longer just a boy who made a fatal navigational error. He became an emblem of youthful arrogance, a symbol of the fool who disobeys his wise father and recklessly challenges the natural order decreed by the gods. His fall was transformed from a personal tragedy into a universal cautionary tale. This editorial practice of adding a moral coda was widespread, especially for stories with ambiguous or disastrous endings. A tragic fate that once might have been seen as simple bad luck or the cruel whim of fate was now framed as a direct and deserved consequence of a character flaw. The scribe in this role ceased to be a mere storyteller and became a moral instructor for the entire culture. His pen ensured that every heroic journey, even a failed one, served a higher societal purpose. It taught the listeners their place, warning against ambition that threatened to upset the established hierarchy, whether it was the authority of a parent or the dominion of the gods. The raw, thrilling story of a boy who flew was carefully edited into a permanent lesson on the price of reaching too high. A hero's virtues are not always universal. When a story crosses a cultural border, its deepest meaning can be completely transformed to resonate with a new audience. Consider the vast migration of Indian folklore as it traveled along the Silk Road and into the heart of Southeast Asia. These tales, filled with brave princes and cunning animals, were raw material waiting for a new purpose. They entered a powerful new editing room, the monastic schools of early Buddhism, where scribes performed a remarkable act of narrative alchemy known as the Jataka tales. These stories were presented as the previous lives of the Buddha before his final enlightenment. In this process, a pre-existing hero from a local folktale, perhaps a king renowned for his strength or a merchant celebrated for his cleverness, would be systematically re-identified. He was no longer just a king or a merchant. He was now the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha himself in one of his countless past lives. The entire climax of the story would be rewired. A narrative that originally ended with the hero winning a battle through martial prowess would be revised. Now, the hero achieves victory not by slaying his foe, but through an astonishing act of self-sacrifice or profound compassion. In one famous Jataka, the future Buddha is a hare who, having no food to offer a hungry holy man, throws himself into a fire to become a meal, an act of ultimate generosity. Another tale might reframe a hero's journey as a lesson in non-violence, where the central conflict is resolved through patience and understanding rather than force. This was more than simple translation, it was a complete spiritual retrofit. The editors were not just changing a character's name, they were implanting a new moral compass into the very heart of the adventure. The hero's journey was stripped of its worldly goals and rewired to illustrate a single, powerful truth, that enlightenment is reached through boundless compassion and selfless action. This process of contextualization allowed Buddhism to absorb and sanctify local traditions, making a new faith feel familiar and deeply rooted. It proves that a hero's ultimate destination is not a throne or a treasure, but a state of being, and that destination can be radically changed by the scribes who guide his path. A scribe's knife could scrape away more than just errors on a parchment. It could erase entire realities deemed too dangerous for public consumption. Across the sprawling transmission of a collection like the 1001 Nights, we see this 16th revision in its most explicit form, the censorship of content that violated the social or sexual mores of a new audience. The original tales, woven from Persian, Indian, and Arabic folklore, were earthy, complex, and often brutally pragmatic. Their heroes were not always chaste, their lovers were not always discreet, and their world was one where desire and survival were intimately and openly linked. This was the raw fabric of the stories as they circulated in the Middle East, but when these tales traveled westward, they entered a very different kind of editing room, one governed by the sensibilities of 18th century Europe. The French scholar Antoine Galland was their first major European translator, and his hand was not that of a neutral scribe, but of a cultural gatekeeper. He systematically bowdlerized the texts, stripping away overt sexual encounters and references to the body that he deemed crude or indecent. He softened the cynical, often darkly humorous tone of the original characters, replacing it with a more romantic and sentimental flavor. In his version, the heroes became more gallant, the heroines more purely virtuous, and the entire world of the knights was transformed from a gritty, lived-in cityscape into a shimmering, fantastical dream. This was not a simple act of translation, it was a profound act of sanitization. The hero's journey was fundamentally rewired, stripped of its human complexities and bodily realities to fit a new, more conservative ideal. A character's motivation might shift from raw lust to courtly love. A clever deception born of survival might be reframed as a noble ruse. This editorial process ensured the stories would be palatable, even delightful, to European salons, but it came at the cost of their original soul. The censoring scribe, in his quest to make the foreign acceptable, had created a new and far less complicated hero, one whose journey was no longer about navigating the messy truths of life, but about escaping into a safely exotic fantasy. A king could borrow a hero's name to make his own reign feel eternal. The legends of Fionn mac Cumhaill and his Fianna warriors are a sprawling tapestry of Irish myth, filled with magical hunts and battles with otherworldly beings. But over centuries of retelling, a fascinating integration occurred. The exploits of these purely mythical figures began to merge with the recorded deeds of actual historical Irish kings and chieftains. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate editorial strategy, the 17th revision, where the line between history and myth was intentionally blurred. A local king from the 8th or 9th century, seeking to solidify his authority, would find his recent victory in a cattle raid or a border skirmish slowly absorbed into the older, grander stories of the Fianna. Suddenly, his personal achievement was no longer a minor political event. It became the latest chapter in an ancient, heroic saga. His name would be spoken in the same breath as Fionn's, linking his mortal lineage to a semi-divine ancestry. This process gave contemporary rulers an instant and unassailable form of legitimacy. They were not just men who had seized power through force or fortune. They were the living heirs to a heroic destiny, their right to rule written into the very myths that defined their culture. The scribes and bards who wove these new threads into the old fabric were not just storytellers, they were political operatives. By integrating a historical figure into a mythical hero cycle, they created a powerful bridge between the legendary past and the political present. A bridge that a king could cross to claim his throne was not just earned but ordained. The hero's greatest battle was slowly moving inward. For centuries, epic poetry celebrated the external triumph, the visible feat of strength, the monster slain on the blood-soaked earth. But a quiet revolution began to stir within the ancient editing rooms, a shift in focus from the hero's hand to the hero's heart. A prime example of this 18th revision is the evolving tale of Jason and the Argonauts. In the oldest surviving versions, the story is a grand adventure checklist, a quest for a magical fleece filled with clashing rocks and bronze-winged warriors. Jason is a relatively flat figure, a leader on a dangerous mission. His foreign bride, the sorceress Medea, is a crucial but enigmatic asset, a princess who helps him secure his prize through her powerful magic. Her actions are monumental, but her reasons remain a mystery, her inner world a locked door. Later retellings, particularly those crafted in the more psychologically curious atmosphere of Hellenistic Greece, pry that door open. The scribes begin to lavish attention on Medea's devastating internal conflict. We are shown the war within her as she betrays her father and murders her own brother to aid Jason's escape. We feel the terrifying clash between her duty to her family and the overwhelming, reckless passion for a stranger. This is no longer just a plot point, it is a profound character study. Even Jason, the archetypal hero, is subjected to this new internal scrutiny. His decisions are no longer portrayed as simple, heroic necessities. Later editors highlight his moral compromises, his willingness to accept the fruits of Medea's horrific acts while remaining distant from the blood on her hands. The quest for the Golden Fleece becomes secondary to the corrosive moral journey the characters undertake. This editorial shift did not just add depth to an old story, it fundamentally rewired the very purpose of a hero's path. The physical itinerary, the map of his travels, became a secondary concern. The primary landscape was now the treacherous, unmapped territory of the human soul. The journey was no longer about where the hero went, but who he became along the way and who he failed to become. This new emphasis on interiority and motive was a literary earthquake. It laid the essential groundwork for everything that followed, from the complex anti-heroes of Roman tragedy to the deeply psychological characters that populate our modern novels. The ancient editors, in choosing to explore the storm within a character's mind, gifted us a new way to understand ourselves, turning the hero's journey into a mirror for our own internal struggles. Disparate tales of gods and giants are one thing, but a world demands a final chapter. The chaotic and often contradictory myths of the Norse peoples presented a puzzle. They were a collection of powerful but isolated poems, each detailing a specific feat of Thor or a cunning scheme of Loki, with no single thread connecting them all. This raw material entered a unique editing room in 13th century Iceland, the study of the scholar and chieftain Snorri Sturluson. His prose Edda is far more than a simple recording of old stories. It is a breathtaking act of narrative unification. Snorri gathered those scattered poetic fragments and wove them into a single, coherent timeline, a grand saga that stretched from the world's creation all the way to its prophesied end. He took individual adventures like Thor's fishing trip where he nearly caught the world serpent and repositioned them. They were no longer just exciting standalone events. They became foreshadowing, crucial pieces of a puzzle leading inexorably toward Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. This single editorial vision gave the entire Norse cosmos something it previously lacked, a profound and tragic sense of destiny. Every hero's journey was now a subplot within this vast, eschatological drama. The death of the beloved god Balder was not just a random tragedy caused by Loki's malice. It was the pivotal, irreversible trigger for the final winter. The gods knew their fate was sealed, that their great battle against the giants and monsters was one they were destined to lose. This knowledge infused every one of their actions with a heartbreaking nobility. In Snorri's hands, the scribe transcended the role of a mere preserver or moralizer. He became a world builder on an epic scale. He took a vibrant but fragmented tradition and gave it a spine, a beginning, a middle, and a devastatingly poetic end. He rewired the entire mythological system, transforming a set of local hero tales into a single, unified story of a world living courageously under the shadow of its own inevitable doom. The most radical revision of all was the one that opened the hero's path to everyone. For centuries, the spiritual journey had been portrayed as a solitary climb, a grueling ascent reserved for the spiritual athlete, the monk who retreated from the world to conquer his own desires. The hero was a solitary figure, and his ultimate prize was a personal escape from the wheel of suffering, a nirvana achieved alone. But within the Mahayana Buddhist editing rooms, a revolutionary new ideal was written into the sacred texts, a 20th revision that rewired the very soul of the hero's journey. This was the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva stands at the very threshold of final enlightenment, their own liberation assured, and makes a breathtaking choice. They vow to postpone their nirvana, to turn back from the brink of personal peace, and to remain in the cycle of rebirth. Their mission is not to escape the world, but to enter it more deeply, to guide every single conscious being toward liberation before they themselves will cross over. Think of the difference this makes. The hero's quest is no longer an inward-focused pilgrimage for a select few. It becomes an outward explosion of active compassion. The bodhisattva's journey is measured not by the mountains they have climbed in meditation, but by the number of hands they have pulled from the mud. This was a profound democratization of the heroic role. Suddenly, the ultimate spiritual hero was not necessarily the ascetic in a remote cave, but could be the farmer in his field, the merchant in the marketplace, or the parent in the home. Any act of selfless generosity, any moment of profound patience, any gesture of true kindness could be a step on the bodhisattva path. The heroic ideal was no longer defined by a person's status or their ability to abandon the world, but by the depth of their commitment to it. This single editorial shift transformed a spiritual elite into a universal call to action, proving that the most epic journey begins not with a retreat from humanity, but with a vow to save it. Yet the most profound revision of all was the quiet vanishing of the scribes themselves. For all the power they wielded, the names of these textual architects have been almost entirely erased from history. We know a precious few like Virgil or Snorri Sturluson, but the countless others who copied, compiled, and altered the great epics remain anonymous ghosts. Their final, brilliant act was to make their own work appear invisible, to present the text not as a malleable document that passed through human hands, but as a received, authoritative, and unchanging tradition handed down from a sacred past. This self-effacement was their ultimate power play. By removing their fingerprints from the manuscript, they ensured that all focus remained fixed on the hero and the gods, never on the mortal scribe who had just smoothed a rough edge, inserted a new virtue, or erased a troublesome goddess. The story felt timeless precisely because its human origins were so carefully scrubbed away. This final edit cemented the myths in our collective imagination as pristine artifacts, not as the layered, contested, and ever-evolving narratives they truly were. It obscured the very process of revision we have spent this entire journey uncovering. Their greatest legacy was to make themselves disappear, ensuring the hero's journey would forever be read as destiny, and not as a choice made by a person in a room holding a pen. Our journey through these 21 rooms uncovers a final, liberating secret. The hero stories we hold as timeless were never fixed in stone. They were living conversations etched onto parchment and clay. Each revision, from Hercules' newfound virtue to Rama's impossible perfection, was not an act of literary vandalism. It was an act of passionate recreation. These scribes were not destroying their heritage. They were wrestling with it, molding ancient figures to embody their own era's deepest questions about power, faith, and what it means to be good. The classic hero journey is a literary palimpsest. Just as an ancient manuscript might have a prayer written over a faded grocery list, our epics are layered documents. Beneath the surface of a perfectly virtuous king, you can sometimes still glimpse the flawed, struggling man. Beneath the civilizing hero, you can sense the ghost of a violent brute. These layers are not a flaw, they are the story's true richness, a record of humanity's evolving soul. So the next time you lose yourself in an ancient myth, listen closely. You are not hearing a single author's solitary voice. You are listening to a vibrant, sprawling argument across centuries, a debate about destiny and duty conducted by countless unknown hands. We would love to hear which heroic transformation surprised you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden layers of our shared past.